I'm Arthur O. I'm the Associate Director of the MFA Photography program here at Parsons School of Design, which is a division of the New School. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's panel. This is an event that's co-sponsored by Aperture, the photography program here at the Parsons, and the Vera List Center for Art and Politics. We're here to celebrate race stories, essays on the power of images, which is a collection of award-winning essays by Maurice Berger. The Parsons Photography program, which includes a BFA and MFA programs, are research-centered and practice-intensive platforms that prepare students to participate in the future of photography and image making. The Vera List Center for Art and Politics is a artist-focused research center and public forum for art, culture, and politics. It was established here at the New School in 1992, a time of rousing debates about freedom of speech, identity politics, and society's investment in the arts. A bare year after its founding in 1993, the Vera List Center appointed its first fellow, Maurice Berger, who set a decisive trajectory for the first few years of the center. Today, the Vera List Center is a leader in the field, supporting politically engaged art, public scholarship, and research throughout the world, and fostering vibrant and diverse communities of artists, scholars, and policymakers who take creative, intellectual, and political risk to bring about positive change. In October of 2020, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, the Vera List Center brought us together online and hosted a day-long celebration of the life of Maurice Berger titled On Race, Representation, and White Lies, which is documented online. I'm very pleased that the Vera List Center is a co-sponsor of this significant celebration of this book, and we're grateful for their commitment to Maurice and the 40-plus fellows who followed him. I will now hand it over to Michael Famighetti, who is the editor-in-chief at Aperture, and to introduce our panelists for tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Arthur. We've been partnering with Parsons for a long time, so it's great to be back here. As Arthur said, I'm Michael Famighetti. I'm the editor-in-chief at Aperture. For those of you who might not be familiar with Aperture, we are a nonprofit publisher that leads conversations around photography worldwide through our publications, exhibitions, and related programming. We would like to thank the photography program at Parsons and the Vera List Center for Art and Politics for hosting us and for their collaboration in bringing you this program. This is a very special night. We are here this evening to celebrate Race Stories, Essays on the Power of Images. This new book is co-published by Aperture and the New York Times and marks the first title in Aperture's Vision and Justice book series, created and co-edited by Drs. Sarah Lewis, Lee Rayford, and Deborah Willis, two of whom we are privileged to have here with us tonight. The Vision and Justice series re-examines and redresses historical narratives of photography, race, and justice. The book series, which was something we've been dreaming about for a long time, is born out of the 2016 landmark issue of Aperture magazine titled Vision and Justice, which was guest edited by Sarah Lewis. Race Stories is a collection of award-winning essays written by Maurice Berger, the groundbreaking cultural historian, curator, and writer, and was edited into this essential volume by Marvin Heiferman. Written between 2012 and 2019 and first published as a monthly feature on the New York Times Lens blog, which was edited by David Gonzalez and Jim Estrin, Berger's incisive essays examine the transformational role photography plays in shaping ideas and attitudes about race, and how photographic images have been instrumental in both perpetuating and combating racial stereotypes. I'll just give you some short bios on our speakers, because otherwise I would be here all night. Marvin Heiferman is a curator, writer, and editor, and producer who organizes exhibitions and online projects about photography and visual culture. His publications include Photography Changes Everything and Seeing Science. Both were published by Aperture. He has contributed essays and articles to numerous artist monographs, catalogs, and publications. He is also the editor of Nan Goldin, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, a book I'm sure many of you have heard of, and of course, Race Stories. Sarah Lewis is an art and cultural historian and founder of Vision and Justice. She is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Humanities and Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard. Her most recent, highly acclaimed book is The Unseen Truth: When Race Changed Sight in America. Deborah Willis is a curator, photographer, and leading scholar of photography and Black studies. She is the University Professor and Chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University, where she is also director of the NYU Institute for African American Affairs and the Center for Black Visual Culture. Her most recent book is Kamala, a photographic tribute to Kamala Harris's rise from district attorney to her historic presidential run in 2024. Our speakers will be able to answer questions at the end of the program, so please save your questions for the conclusion. And there will be copies of Race Stories available for purchase and signature in the event cafe following this program, along with copies of Kamala by Deborah Willis and The Unseen Truth by Sarah Lewis. Once again, I'd like to thank Parsons and the Vera List Center for hosting us, and thank you again for coming out on a cold February evening. I'll now pass it over to our panelists.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Michael, and thanks to Aperture and Parsons Photography Program and the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School. I just thought the way to start today's presentation about race stories was to let Maurice speak for himself for a little bit. It makes perfect sense, and it's easier than me talking for him. So we have two video clips to listen to. These are from a video that was made for ICP in 2018 when Maurice won the Infinity Award for critical writing. Maurice was trained as an art historian and did his PhD, for example, on Robert Morris and minimalism and minimalist sculpture, but race was something that was always on his mind. And in 1990, he wrote this essay for Art in America that was in the September issues, our art museum, Racist, at a time when most museums were, at best, doing token insertions of work by African-American artists. The article kind of blew up. It, I think, played a role in contributing to Maurice losing his job at Hunter. And he had to kind of reinvent himself. And that's around the time that he started working at the Vera List Center, too, when art and politics became more of a focus for him in terms of what art and imagery could do. He did wind up working at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where the Center for Art, Design, and Visual Culture kind of gave him a lot of latitude in terms of the kind of programming he could do. So he did, for example, the first Adrian Piper retrospective 18 years before MoMA did it. He did a Fred Wilson retrospective. He did a show about whiteness. He also did a big exhibition called For All the World to See that opened in 2010, and the exhibition was about visual culture and the civil rights movement. So it was done for University of Maryland. It opened in New York at ICP. It went to the Smithsonian, where it was, I think, the third show for the National Museum of African American History and Culture before they moved into their new building on the Mall. And it got a tremendous amount of attention because he combined photographs, television shows, movies, all kinds of aspects of visual culture to look at the civil rights movement and how imagery impacted it. After the show was at ICP, it was 2012, this is 2 years later, it's Gordon Parks' 100th birthday. And strangely enough, nobody was doing anything about it in New York. And so ICP decided, let's do something. And because of Maurice's involvement in For All the World to See, they said, how about doing something in the windows on the street? So he said, sure, and did an installation that was on the north-facing side of ICP. So this is on 43rd Street and 6th Avenue. And it was a couple of monitors, and material about parks, and it stayed up for a year. And Maurice was fascinated by having this work out on the street. It wasn't in a museum, it wasn't in a book, it was for the public, for all the world to see in a funny sort of way. What happened was he loved going and looking at it. And so, we would go and take a look at it and photograph people looking at the Gordon Parks display. And one of the people who saw it was Jim Estrin, who was an photographer editor at the New York Times, who, with David Gonzalez, was running Lens Blog at the New York Times at that point. And Jim invited Maurice to come over to the Times and have lunch, and said, hey, would you like to write a piece for us? And Maurice said, yeah, because it was something that he kind of grew up doing when he grew up in the projects, and he and his father would walk around on the streets of the Lower East Side. He would pick up copies of the New Yorker that people had thrown out in Esquire, and would read all these magazines and dreamed of having that kind of audience. And so he did, and the first piece appeared in the summer of 2012. And then it became a monthly piece, and then Maurice asked him if he could use the title Race Stories and kind of give it an identity, and he did. So it was an incredible opportunity for him because of audience. He was very, very interested in audience and knew that when something went up on the blog, tens of thousands of people were looking at it. And it triggered all kinds of comments. And he was also very interested in talking about photographic images and showing photographic images and supporting projects that don't usually get mainstream support. In reading Sarah's book, which came out a couple of months ago, The Unseen Truth, Sarah writes about Frederick Douglass, and I thought this was something that would be interesting to share. Douglass presciently articulated that the revolution of the new medium was as much about representation as perception. He would become one of the first American thinkers to make a case for the twofold political force of pictures as both object and prompt, a mental picture that could either reinforce or critique stereotypes. Douglass argues that the same medium that had been used to read the Negro out of the human family could subversively be used to read him back in. And that's kind of what Maurice was trying to do in the newspaper every month. And so he got free rein to write about what he wanted to. And mostly he didn't write about big exhibitions. He wrote about books that wouldn't normally get publicity or artist works that weren't being seen widely. So, for example, he wrote about the photographs of Emmett Till's murder and how Emmett Till's mother used photography and her visibility in the media to draw attention to what happened to her kid. He was a big supporter of young photographers, young artists, and he wrote very early about people like Nona Faustine and LaToya Ruby Frazier, and it was an incredible boost for them to have their work written about in the New York Times. He was interested in media and how civil rights leaders and were cognizant of the media's power and used it to kind of create messages to go out into the world in a very sophisticated way. He was also interested in not just showing the violence of civil rights and the troublesome aspects of race and representation, but was really interested in glamour, in culture, in music. So he wrote about glamour photography. Somebody did a book about dandyism, and he wrote a whole piece about that. He was fascinated with archival work, and so this was an article about a series of photographs that Dorothea Lange made of Japanese internment, and he would, he just liked to go from issue to issue as much as he could. He was horrified by Charlottesville, which appeared in that video briefly, and this was probably the piece that he wrote that generated the most comments on it because people were so horrified by what they had seen and what it seemed to suggest in terms of where the country was going. He was also interested in how racism was as much a northern and liberal thing as it was a southern thing. So he's fascinated by this photograph of Robert Franks taken in San Francisco because it's Frank, the white guy, standing on a hill taking a picture of this couple kind of looking up at him like, huh, like, who are you? what's up. He was fascinated too, going back to the medium, and Gordon Parks, who was his hero. Parks was his hero because Parks made photographs, made movies, wrote novels. He used imagery in the media in extraordinary ways. So this was a piece about, this is Gordon Parks' first piece for Life magazine, and it's about the arguments about how to crop pictures and which pictures to include and which to leave out. And then he also, this is what he wrote about for the Vision and Justice issue of Aperture. He was right. He did an article for that about Obama and how Obama was represented in photographs. And this photograph was one of his favorites. It's a meeting in the Oval Office when a 5-year-old kid whose father was working in the government and leaving his job brought him in for a photo op. And the kid looks at Obama and says, "Is your hair like mine?" And Obama bends over and says, "Touch it, dude." And Pete Souza takes the picture. This is something else that Maurice said in that video, which you can see online. You can Google that, and it's easily found. But I think this kind of is the crux of what the Race Stories book is about, and much of what the Vision and Justice Project is about, the book series, and the issue that was done in Aperture. The camera is a remarkable tool of political persuasion and activism. The great photographers of race and civil rights understood it wasn't only about photographing someone getting hit over the head with billy clubs, bitten by dogs in Birmingham, or being thrown to the ground. The story of race, of civil rights, of identity is a big story. So I like to write about photographers who tell big stories, not just about conflagrations, violence, and protests, but about what happens every single day in the lives of people. There's a brilliance and beauty and profundity. It's all out there. I'm interested in writing about what is not normally written about in the mainstream press, about photographers who aren't famous enough, about issues of race that people are uncomfortable with. My greatest passion is to be an educator. How do you teach visual literacy, then racial literacy through visual literacy? And that was really kind of at the crux of what he did. And when he looked back at the projects he had done, it was the Race Stories essays that he thought was the most important thing to do. And when people would ask Maurice, "Who's your audience?" And I mentioned earlier, he liked audience. He liked having his shows seen by hundreds of thousands of people, or however many people walked on 6th Avenue in a year. And his answer to that was that he wrote for really smart high school kids. That what he wanted to do was communicate. He kind of came out of graduate programs that were theory drenched and kind of walked away from all of that to try to communicate very clearly with people about issues that were really, really important. And that's what the book tries to do. That's what we tried to do in the book. The book represents the majority of the pieces that he wrote for the Times, and it's great to see them in print and together. So I hope you take a look at that. This is Maurice actually talking about racial literacy and visual literacy at a Gordon Parks exhibition that he curated. It was in 2019, yes, there was a Vision and Justice convening that Sarah organized at Harvard and Radcliffe, and Maurice did the show. And Maurice, who never talked about race in public, which makes it ironic for me always to be talking about race in his work in public, loved to talk to people one-on-one. So this is the way he liked to reach people, either by having them read what he wrote in books or in the newspaper or on the walls. Thanks. Sarah's going to talk a little bit about the Vision and Justice Project, I think. Yes? Yeah.
Right. Good evening. Can you hear me all right? All right. And so looking forward to this time together to speak about Race Stories, Maurice Berger's legacy, with two friends and colleagues and mentors who I hold in such high regard, Dr. Deborah Willis and Marvin Heiferman. Thank you all for coming out tonight. There's so many in the audience who we all have as friends and colleagues, and it's great to be able to have time to fellowship together. What is the role of art for justice in American democracy? In many ways, Maurice was my North Star in understanding this question. The unthinkable loss of Maurice made me want to do all that I could with the tools at my disposal to live out what he taught us. My last conversation with him was about The Unseen Truth. He was a peer reviewer for the book. He didn't believe in anonymity, so he told me. But little did we know that, in fact, what we were discussing as we roved around thinking through the impact of his work and what could come next was in fact the creation of Race Stories. This is the most recent Vision and Justice initiative. It's a new book series with Aperture. Sarah Meister is here, Michael Famigetti is here, so many wonderful colleagues there are here tonight. It's a new publishing initiative that presents a history of race, images, and justice in America. It's part of the larger Vision and Justice initiative, a catalytic civic initiative that generates original research, curricula, and programs that reveal the foundational role of visual culture in generating equity and justice in America. It has become a resource for cultural leaders in fostering representational literacy and justice. This book series is one that I am so deeply honored to co-edit with Drs. Deborah Willis and Lee Rayford, who is here with us in spirit. It is the first book in the series, the only one that we felt could be the first in the series. Why? Well, Maurice's work throughout his career and his courage offer the Bible and model that we need to understand how to connect the work of culture for justice in our age. We often see the power of culture during a time of crisis. We're in the midst of one now. The racial reckoning of 2020 and the pandemic together was another such event. I knew during that period that Maurice and I would have considered the debates about the potential and limits of how and when images create empathy. And I wrote a piece in the New York Times deliberately there to honor him. I thought of what he would have said about the lack of images during the pandemic to fully convey the stakes of the crisis, about how the impact of photographs of people affected by the tainted water in, say, Flint, Michigan, aided the start of a nationwide understanding of the unconscionable injustice uncovered by Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha and illuminated by photographers such as LaToya Ruby Frazier. We would have talked about, as we did, reports on the Civil War and the death count filled newspapers, but it was photographs that conveyed the cost of the conflict in a way that nothing else could. We might have referred back to the Farm Security Administration project with sent-out photographers such as Gordon Parks and Dorothea Lange to capture the depth of the country's suffering during the Depression. He understood that images force us to contend with the unspeakable. They help humanize clinical statistics to make them comprehensible. They step onto the breach. To launch the Vision and Justice book series, I reached out to Aperture, and after years of vision, labor, fundraising, working now with my extraordinary co-editors, we've launched the series, and we celebrate Maurice through it, as we do tonight. Now, as we know, the racial regime that we live with has put a stranglehold on American democracy, and it's been secured through a transformation in vision. Maurice knew that we owe so much to the work of image makers such as Gordon Parks, who crafted idioms to expand the narrative of who counts and who belongs in American life. He knew that in representational democracy, rights are many, but foremost among them is the right to be seen justly. The racial divide in American life is built on a fiction. Making fictions real has turned our work as viewers, as judges, into near daily political acts. We're living with the consequences of that today. Maurice knew that this was deadly serious work, and he would take up arms with anyone who didn't understand that. He never underestimated why the work of critics and lens-based artists of color, whose work has been so critical for the work of American democracy, needed to endure and be supported. He identified what makes this work so urgent. As Marvin mentioned, a critical part of the unfinished work of the history of race and representation is audience. He wanted to ensure that people within, and most importantly beyond the art world, saw how we understand race through pictures today and have over time. He understood that racial literacy could come from visual literacy. And this book is a primer, and each essay models how it's done. Maurice understood that this work takes time. And I should also say the time and care that the creation of the series involves is also freighted on the shoulders of our incredible colleagues, many of whom are listed here, some of whom I see in the audience, all of whom are listed here. Maurice, as Marvin mentioned, is in lineage with a thinker such as Frederick Douglass, who understood and anticipated that we would be here 150 years after he delivered Pictures in Progress, his landmark speech from 1861, delivered first in Boston's Tremont Temple, about what would have seemed like a trifle in the state of that nation-severing conflict, namely pictures and the power they have to ignite the imagination, to see the world anew. I picture him redrafting this speech in his study in Anacostia, as I'm showing you here, multiple times over the course of his life. I won't speak too much about Japanese internment. I know that Marvin mentioned it, but there are many ways in which he understood that this work takes time. And I think about his meditations on Dorothea Lange's intervention in the history of Japanese internment as one such example. He anticipated that these works would endure to show us when a measure of injustice was nearly unthinkable, but existed, as it did in the case of Japanese internment for 3 years. In The Unseen Truth, a book that he was excited for me to complete as it took over 10 years, I think about the endurance of time and vision inspired by his example. And I wanted to mention an experience that concludes the book as a way of thinking about what Maurice taught me. I wrote about an experience I had when going to Washington National Cathedral. It's a cathedral where Martin Luther King Jr. offered his final Sunday sermon before his assassination 1 week prior. It's a cathedral that also once held stained glass windows dedicated to Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. After the killing of the Emanuel 9, they were removed and replaced by windows by Carrie James Marshall and a tablet of poetry by Elizabeth Alexander. What had gone unmentioned in the reporting about this new commission is that Wilson's memorial is directly next to not only the that Woodrow Wilson's memorial is directly next to these new installations, replacing the Confederate stained glass windows. Joined by an open-air arched passageway, they are porous to each other, connected through place and time. Now, Woodrow Wilson is the only president interred at Washington National Cathedral, I learned. His sarcophagus and cenotaph that you're seeing on the right are in the nave, on the ground floor, next to the pews for worship. The church was built by an act of Congress and deliberately set high on this point in the area of Washington, D.C. as a house of prayer for all people. Through Wilson's administration, federal segregation was both inaugurated and made commonplace. His achievements came alongside an easy disregard of racism, of the kind that was, as renowned constitutional scholar and Princeton University president Christopher Eisgruber put it, quote, significant and consequential even by the standards of his own time. In the 1950s, the cathedral's dean, who was Wilson's grandson, oversaw the installation of the tomb on the ground floor, dedicated it there 800 years after his birth. Sayre, too, would speak to causes that directly contradiction of Wilson's legacy. This new commission by Marshall and Alexander really together symbolized the forces that we've used to revise the narratives about who belongs and who counts in American life, namely culture and visuality. But as I stood there, the Reverend Canon Leonard Hamlin at the cathedral said to me after a long silence, "It takes so long for us to see. Time has brought us to this point. It's easy to go to one side or the other, but that tension, that's where we go to look for answers and to learn about ourselves." Maurice understood that. I'd nearly missed the Memorial Bay for Wilson myself. To see it, I had to move up close, shift my vantage point, and stay aware of all of the details that surrounded me, not just what might be of interest for my current task. It takes so long for us to see. I thought of his words as I went back to my hotel that day and watched the January 6th hearings that were on. And it was a hearing that was designed to get the public to trust that what we saw was what we actually saw. The contradictions at the country's founding, the tension between slavery and freedom, between equality and commitment to the fabrication that upheld racial dominance have played out nowhere more than in the visual realm. It's made vision the work of seeing the full truth in this extraordinary history, the crucible of American democracy. We are in the midst of a crisis of regard in the United States. Amidst our triumphs, our persistent unwillingness to see each other at times has put pressure on the operation of vision and pictures themselves. It takes so long for us to see until we come to these moments of tension and crisis. But Maurice knew that we needed these works to get through it. His writing was courageous. He was committed to do that rarest thing in American life, to deploy his position to say with fire what many would not dare, come what may. As a professor and writer, I'm going back here, and I like to land there, and curator, he marshaled his command of the history of visual culture to state the absolute truth that needed to be heard, not just for the moment, but for all time. Maya Angelou once said that courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any of the others consistently. Maurice had that in spades. He led with his heart and backed it up with his brilliance. It gave his work fire. It made him a force. In all his work, he had a common refrain: to take down everything that prevents us from honoring life. He had an ethical clarity, the rigorous study required to back it, and the rhetorical style required to help people pay attention. We salute our friend and hope that this volume inspires further scholarship of the kind that he pioneered. As the series co-editors collectively, I'd just like to thank Aperture and the New York Times for publishing this volume. I'm grateful too to those like Agnes Gund and Darren Walker, who so generously supported its production and that of the entire series. I'm so grateful to Maurice's husband, Marvin. And I am, along with his daughter in Maurice, with Deb and Lee, I'm so grateful for his friendship and want to celebrate his legacy. Thank you. Right.
We're going to talk amongst us, and I would love to hear from Deb about your early interactions with Maurice. Maurice always talked about you and how you were the pioneer in this field. You were the queen of this. He was in awe of what you did as a scholar, as an artist, as a curator. And I'm curious when he got on your radar, or when did you meet?
We met, it's good to see everyone here. Thank you, New School and Aperture, for making this happen. But we met when I was working at Schomburg Center, and we maintained a relationship. We talked about his first book in terms of living downtown in the Lower East Side, and living the stories that he shared with me about the high school and elementary school and the neighborhood that he grew up in. At that time, I was a young curator, just out of grad school, working at the Schomburg, developing the photography collection, creating categories and stories to expand the collection. Schomburg had an extensive collection, and Arthur Schomburg himself also photographed when he traveled to Spain and other places looking for items to be a part of the collection. So the opportunity to catalog and reorganize was, instrumental in storytelling. And how do we tell a story about love, about dreaming, about, difficulties, but also about Black play. So we talked about how do we tell a story about Black life and humanities. And then I left Schaumburg and moved to DC, and he was at UMBC by then. And so we had the opportunity to explore how do we talk about visual culture and teach, as I was developing an African American Museum on a Mall concept with Claudine Brown. And so we overlapped in our love of images, overlapped in our love of Gordon Parks, who was pivotal to both of us in our early years. And so we stayed, we talked often, as you know, on the phone, visiting your place on Upper West Side. But what I found fascinating about our exchange, it was humor. We were really serious about our work. We felt that we needed to intervene the visual culture with images not only of the experience of the older photographers, but we wanted to also include work by younger photographers. We wanted to talk about how do we expand the narrative of work that looks at the Black female body. And Carla Williams and I worked over, and I think we started the project sometime in the late 80s, probably 89. She was a grad student, and she was also working, she was probably undergraduate when she was at Princeton but that year, but we met later when she was a grad student at University of New Mexico. And we were talking about the missing images about Black women, but also photographs were made in Europe, in Africa, in the Caribbean, as well as in the States. So we wanted to create, these images. We wanted to create a book. We talked to Marvin, we talked to you too during that time when we were in DC. But what was the title of your book that you?
Photography Changes Everything.
Yeah, yes. And we talked about how important it was to celebrate the aspect, how photography changes and change the image of Black women who were activists, who were artists, but also models and women who photograph themselves. So with that experience and working over time, we continued, celebrating our work in different ways. He worked with the Gordon Parks Foundation and trying to travel some of the exhibitions and some of the images. He invited me to attend some of the lectures and speak with him when the All the World to See exhibition traveled in Pennsylvania and other places. So we walked into each other with the Jewish Museum when that television show which was just a fascinating moment. So my love and respect for him is based into a long history that many of us miss. Rick Powell, I met Rick Powell in the 80s. I was at Schaumburg, and he was, doing research and traveling Chicago and just sharing moments about Howard University. But he understood what it meant for both of us, developing our careers, but looking at the photographic archive. We used to sit at my desk. He's researching, but then we needed to talk about what we uncovered with enthusiasm. It's really hard for people to understand that finding images, Kelly Jones. So these moments of, community that we developed in the 80s, sustained me as a curator and someone who also wanted to make images. And he invited me. He said, you need to show me your images. I'm really excited that you're finally doing your work. And it happened because Carrie Mae Weems invited me to be a part of the Eatonville project and Zora Neale Hurston. And he saw the images and said, I want to share these images. He knew I was interested in beauty and how do we talk about beauty, growing up in a beauty shop. And so he shared all of these exchanges and encouraged me to push forward and, look at others, but also look at your own work. And the difficult part that I recall was in 2020, in March of 2020, he called me up. He called one day, David Driscoll called the next day.
Wow.
And they both said to me, same words, be careful, stay safe. He said to me, I'm gonna write while I'm upstate, and I just want to make sure that you're safe. David Driscoll called me and said, I'm just going into the hospital for a minor surgery, but I just want you to be safe and be careful. And the two of them were, David was my mentor for a long time, but they both shared with me the sense of what I needed to do and to alert me to continue the work. And that's stayed with me, and it's still a part of my reason to tell his story and support this project that we believed. And the fact is that, I was a juror for one of the years for the Infinity Awards, and that a lot of people didn't want to understand race. They didn't wanted to use the term race. And so I watched how uncomfortable people who were jurors and responding to just the notion of race in a discussion about how do we look at images, how do we share images, how do we highlight this? And, it broke my heart that I couldn't convince the jurors that he needed to get the Infinity Award that year. And so we fought. I shared with, he was heartbroken as well. And the next year, of course, he received it because, we continued that battle of talking to the curators and other jurors to understand that we have to talk about race, we have to talk about freedom, and we have to talk about dreaming. And that's why I'm really happy to be here today.
Thanks, thank you. I mean, one of the things that struck me, Sarah, and what you were speaking about was the idea of time and how things take time. And just kind of looking back at the period of time when you first met Maurice, and we're talking 40 years, right? It's a long time. And it's kind of fascinating to see the Vision and Justice project happen and to see how audiences change in people's willingness to look at things and see things is, I think, maybe changing a little. So maybe the two of you could talk a little bit about the Vision and Justice project and how you see that getting out to the world.
Remember our breakfast before you met with Michael.
That's right. I'm taking this moment in because it's really powerful to think through how also the intimate conversation can detonate and launch what then can live on in time. I don't make, well, when I was invited to guest edit an issue of Aperture, it didn't have to be Vision and Justice, that's what we decided to title it. I did meet with, of course, Deb Willis, and what a gift to be able to have her counsel, right, in these different moments. But especially that one, it did talk about dreaming. There was this foundation of dreaming really at the heart of that invitation. It was accepting of the prompt was really, I think Michael would attest, a moment where I said, but I want to be allowed to dream through this. It wasn't simply yes to the request. And the dream was to be able to create a framework of thinking that would allow for the endurance of a new way of considering how images change society, grounded in the framework of Frederick Douglass. And your support to go in with that objective really allowed that to happen. I'm just so moved by hearing too, so much of, I want to hear you speak more about Maurice, and part of why I just delivered the talk was so that Deb could just speak up here more. But I've been thinking so much about generational time, what's necessary. One of the gifts I think that Maurice had was to be able to see how you're fashioned for the era, He was as meticulous and rigorous in terms of thinking about the image as he was as when he saw you, You know, and what I'm hearing you describe is that he saw you. He saw your contribution, your objective, and discerned where you were going. He encouraged you to do the work because he saw that it was necessary for that period. And there was something in me that he saw before I saw it in myself, you know. So this notion of generational time is what we're saluting. The Vision and Justice Initiative isn't something that came about because I wanted it to live on. The audience, again, back to that, is really what willed it into a project that could live on. I was stunned by the response. I didn't expect the issue to do what it did. You know, it's in its fourth printing now. It sold out within 7 weeks. The demand for it resulted in K through 12 educators writing me really every week asking for ways to teach it in the classroom, from Kentucky to Wyoming. I had no sense that that could occur, but that hunger, that need, gave me a sense of how I was fashioned for the era, how I was meant to contribute. And you know, so much of that thinking about audience did come from living by ICP when that show was up, the Parks show, and going by often and thinking through how people were responding to it, stopping, reconsidering their environment. Mm-hmm. You know, growing up with Reflections in Black in my home, right? And asking myself, oh, what is left out of the images that I'm seeing on a daily basis that are here but need to be, you know. So I didn't expect it, but the radial project, the curriculum, the public-facing programs, the convenings, which we're about to remount. There's a new one happening in October at the Ford Foundation, which we'll disclose more about soon. And the book series is a way to let the framework that began with the issue live on in a radial fashion. You know? Wow. But I couldn't do it without the fellowship that comes from this kind of an event.
And it was also important that first-year students at NYU, at Tisch, that it was required reading.
Yes.
And many of the students said that it was an introduction to a life and stories they never learned in K to 12. Yeah. So it was an amazing opportunity for teachers as well as for first-year students.
No, thank you. And that year, I don't know, the next year, this is a reminder to check your office voicemail, which I rarely do. I received a voicemail from the office of Congressman John Lewis, because he wanted to speak about the Vision and Justice Initiative at this penultimate march from Selma to Montgomery in front of his congressional colleagues, and I was stunned by that request. I didn't know he knew anything about the project, but there was a language it offered to people that was accessible, legible, so it lives.
As you talking about language, with this book, I love the way that the subject headings guide us to revisiting images and history, but also the whole aspect of what he says. There's a section on the dandy, as you mentioned, and he was always a dandy. Yeah. You know, his selection of clothes and the colors, just the way that he would walk in the room in terms of witnessing that beauty was essential when that exchange. So it would stun people with this, dandyism that is part of a storytelling that engages people to have a conversation about not only what you're wearing, but, so what are you writing about? And, and that was the curiosity that I found fascinating, the way that you organize these sections of history and memory, engaging the past to understand the present. And I know that you kind of created a story that's kind of a quilt of that overlapped in different ways. So I think it's really important for those of you who have a chance to purchase the book to think about ideas of witnessing and visualizing communities and the connections that we all have.
Yeah, well, on the subject of conversation, it would be great to take questions if there are any, but before we do it, I just want to bring up one point that I was thinking of before I came over here that is interesting to have an event like this in the context of photography programs, when the work that Maurice wrote about bridged genres and all of people who are working in the field. What's one of the interesting things about race and representation is the breadth of imagery that comes into telling the story of it. And so a show like For All the World to See had press prints and photojournalistic prints and fashion magazines. As Deb was saying, it's a whole world, and with a real serious look at how images work in that world. And I think that's probably, for me, one of the most interesting things about what Maurice could do, because he did it with great rigor, but as you're saying, with great love for what he was writing about. Yeah.
You know, I have a project, I'm photographing closets, and I would have loved to have an opportunity to photograph his closet.
You still can.
I still can?
It's so good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty
Calling
much the
you on
same.
that one.
I'll have
Yeah.
an idea for you.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Anybody have questions, thoughts, comments?
Okay.
It's hard to see.
Great.
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you for being here this evening. It's an honor to be in the room with all of you.
Can you also say your name?
Yes, I'm here. My name is Phoenix Robles. I am a visual storyteller in the field of photography, and a lot of my work explores Black maternal identity
I can't see.
within this society. I'll stand up for you.
It's hard to see.
And so one of the things that you mentioned was you, Ms. Willis, was the discomfort that people have speaking about race in general. And I was wondering, when you all were producing and editing this book, I often find that when people do speak about race, they only speak of the uncomfortable aspects of race. How important was it for you to find a balance between the uncomfortable parts of telling a story about a community, as well as finding these special moments of dignity? And how do you put that in the book when people only want to see the uncomfortable parts of something? Yeah.
And thank you for that question, because it's important that that we all, we travel a lot, and when I'll never forget, I was in Poland and I showed photographs. I talked about photographs of Black culture and Black life and range, and it talked about Du Bois, his exhibition for the 1900 World's Fair, and it says the progress of the Negro race, and it's fascinating that Douglas, in terms of how do we think about picture in progress.
Yeah.
But in progress, and here I'm in this Warsaw, in this museum, and a young, one older man said to me, I only know Black people through lynching. Why didn't you have any lynching images in this, in your talk? And I said that's what you know about Black culture. Yeah. But the range of we know horror, we know death, we also know beauty, and we also know spirituality and life and love. And he said, we don't see that here in Warsaw of Black people. We only see the death of Black people. And you needed to include that. So I said, but you remember those images. I want you to remember these images in the story of Black life, that other people said, oh, thank you for reminding us that we are all human. And that aspect of it, and that's why it was important for us to have this project as the first project, to have a Walls photograph on the cover. Can we pull that back up? As the cover image, where we're thinking about, we have different covers for the project, and to have the King family, this one?
Oh, yes.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
The King family, as well as a contemporary photographer.
Yeah.
We have Avedon and two crucial, important photographers, portrait photographers of their period, in a time period. So it was easy for us because we knew how to visualize that story about humanity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Holly Bass. I have a question for Dr. Lewis. You were talking about how you've been thinking about generational time.
Yes.
And I'm also interested in, well, this could actually be for any of you, but your thoughts on political time. And so thinking about the moment that we're in right now and how much time is required to synthesize the moment and to kind of create that lens of cultural literacy when things are happening at a very fast pace with a deep sense of urgency. How do you find that sort of space or distance to be able to do that synthesis and increase people's cultural literacy in the moment?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it is for all of us. One of the practices I have when I'm in Cambridge and I'm walking, and I'll walk by Du Bois's home, which is 3 blocks or so from mine, where he lived when he was an undergraduate off campus because he wasn't allowed to be in the dorms effectively. And I think through the racial nadir that he lived in that moment, and we'll think of his writings from that period. And I mark how much contrast there was between his optimism about what could come and the seemingly bleak racial circumstances that he existed in at the time. So to live in political time, generational time, I think you always have to live in 2 contexts. What might be happening in the moment, but what can come from your labor, from your work. And that's to live in generational time. It's to think about how you can contribute, not just for that moment, but for the era, for the next, for even the decades that will come. And some of that requires it necessarily not being about you. You might not see the impact of your labors, right? Or you might if you're, but it shouldn't matter, right? So that's part of it. The depth required to process the speed of the moment, I think, necessitates slowing down, getting still. I think, and I was thinking of this when, I could say Deb now, was just talking about the joy in speaking with Maurice, and the love and the humor. And that's a way of creating a different kind of internal time, buoyancy, resilience in the face of what can be devastating. So we're always doing that, I think, wrestling with what we need to do internally to not let the onslaught of the speed of what's happening, blunt your enthusiasm. That's a lot of what this fellowship is. It's not just a notion that joy is a resistance, it's a requirement for living.
In thinking about both of those questions and how Maurice wrote his pieces, time was very much part of it. The pieces had to be about 1,000 words a piece to run in the Times. It was a blog, and there's always arguments about how much text you can do, online before somebody's going to tune out. So thinking about the way Maurice was able to condense ideas and especially put out information that might make people uncomfortable, speaking to the earlier question, was really interesting. Maurice would never wanted to push people too much, but he always pushed people. And that's what's kind of brilliant about the essays when you read them, is to watch what he was able to pack into these really short essays, which is why they're used so often in high school and college classes. They're short, they're readable, they raise really interesting issues. Maurice always said, if somebody reading these things, if I can help them walk out of their racism, right, that would be something. But the challenge was to do it quickly and concisely.
Yeah.
Okay, it's 8 o'clock, 8:07.
Yeah.
So opportunity to purchase the book.
Sounds good to me. Let me offer a little reminder of the book
thank
we're
you.
celebrating. Yeah. Thank you.